Hello. So recently on a Zoom session, I was asked by Andrew to give a presentation about the pentagram, which is what I'm going to do now. I'm calling this the pentagram and its occult significance. Now, the word occult might trigger a few people. I'm using the word in its true meaning. The word occult means something hidden, something concealed. So like a solar eclipse, for instance, when the moon goes in front of the sun is occulted. It's hidden behind the moon. So the pentagram and symbolism that relates to it is concealed and hidden through interesting periods of English history. So the pentagram itself does, as a symbol, goes way, way back to the ancient world, even Mesopotamia, I think, but I'm primarily, because of the ogham, I'm looking at medieval and Elizabethan Renaissance history and what it meant to the Britons and British and English and so on. So it's actually got a lot of occult meanings to different people, and it's significant to the ogham because there's hidden pentagrams in the ogham. So this is first attempt to take a look at the pentagram and what it means. And spoiler alert, I would say it means the planet Venus and the goddess of nature, who has many names like the Rose Queen or the Fairy Queen and so on, the Queen of Every Hive. And I'm going to give a presentation explaining all of that. For the witches of England, she was the Queen of Elfheim or the Rose Queen. It's quite interesting. But Venus and the planet Venus is what the pentagram really represents. So one book that is really useful is this one. It's called In Love with Venus by Angela Moore. It's only a slim book. It's really worth getting hold of. I'm going to show a little bit in my presentation. It says a touch of astronomy can change your life forever. But it's all about not horoscopes, but it's about the beautiful patterns that the planet Venus makes in her orbit around the Earth, between the Earth and the Sun. And it's really important, and it explains the pentagram and the importance of 5-petaled flowers and so on, because of the harmonies involved with it all. Some of this insights, esoteric and occult insights of this Venus law came to the revealed, maybe is a good word. It was revealed to the outer world in the 1500s and 1600s by a mysterious organization called the Rosicrucians. And they got a mysterious history because they were occult, they were hidden. And when the printing press was invented, they printed out manuscripts and manifestos, and they challenged the Catholic Church and all of that kind of thing. And the main challenge to Catholicism in the Renaissance was Protestant church reinterpreting the Bible, of course. But on the sidelines were mystics and occultists who weren't particularly Christian. Some of them were Christian mystics, but others are what you might now call pagan. And again, they were just wanting to express themselves and celebrate magic and mystery and the beginnings of science, rather than be controlled by the Vatican and so on. So that's kind of what the Rosicrucians were doing initially. And then they got incorporated into Freemasonry, and Freemasonry gave birth to something called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in the 1800s, which is the beginning of the Western magical tradition, or continuation of Rosicrucianism. Complicated stuff. But anyway, I'm going to take a look at the pentagram and the planet Venus and the mysteries it holds, and its relationship to the Ogham, whatever that may be. You've got to make your own mind up at the end. So I'm just sharing ideas, not any dogma. So I'm just going to bring up my PowerPoint presentation. I've got 40 pictures. It's quite a big one. There. Okay. So the pentagram, of course, is important to the Ogham because there are two pentagrams that we're very aware of now that interlace with each other. So in this diagram, you've got the dark green pentagram, which are the evergreen trees, and you've got the Rose family pentagram, which is the golden one here, and they're interlaced with each other. And as we've discussed in other videos, that there's Irish Celtic law to talk about the yew tree and the apple tree, upon which these are anchored, winter solstice and summer solstice. I won't go into that now, it's in other things. But actually, the Ogham has 4 pentagrams. It's way complicated, and I don't have a clue yet, you know, because my brain's just too befuddled with other things. But there are actually 4 pentagrams to be aware of, and they're anchored on each of the stations of the sun. So if you look at this, forget all the crisscrossy lines, just look at the colors. So the dark green pentagram is anchored at winter solstice on the yew tree. The lighter yellowy green pentagram is anchored at the apple tree at summer solstice. And that's those two interlaced. Now, there's also a red pentagram, which is anchored with the elder tree at the autumn equinox. And there's a white pentagram anchored on the ash tree at the spring equinox. So there's 4 pentagrams, and they're anchored to summer solstice, spring equinox, winter solstice, and autumn equinox. You know, they're there. I don't know what to make of it, you know, but they're there. So this presentation is a glimpse at the significance of the pentagram and what it might mean to the Ogham. Again, no dogma, you've got to figure things out for yourself. So I'm just sharing some insights, and I've got some knowledge of occult symbolism history of Britain. So that's what I'm going to share right now. So just to clarify, the word pentagram means the 5-pointed star. Now, what's very popular in the modern day with movements like Wicca and other neo-paganism is a circle around the pentagram. And when there's a circle around it, it's a pentacle. And it's a magical talisman, usually of protection. So it's a pentacle is a talisman with a circle around it. A pentagram is just a 5-pointed star, you know, and there's many ideas about what a pentacle or a pentagram represents to different people. None of them are wrong. The only one I would question is the fear that people have of an inverted pentagram, that somehow it represents the horns of a goat, that it's devilish, it's black magic, and so on. But really, there's no real history to that. That's more like dodgy Hammer horror films and heavy metal bands, you know, using it with their album covers. There is a logic that with a pentagram pointing upwards is drawing energy downward, and a pentagram pointing downwards is sending energy downwards, you know. But you know, these are modern ideas, really. They're not really there in the ancient or even Renaissance magics. But simplistically then, very simplistically, it's almost shallow really, but you know, one idea of the pentagram is that it represents the body of a person, you know, the two legs, two arms, and the head. And an extension of that is that it can represent the five senses, you know, or even the five elements, which in modern paganism can be earth, air, fire, and water, and the fifth one, spirit. You know, so for some people it just represents that, which you could say are the elements of a person. Earth I am, fire I am, water and air, and spirit I am, those kind of ideas. And they're valid, they're okay, but that's kind of it, you know. It doesn't really tell you the history or the deeper occult meaning of what the pentagram is. So let's take a delve down the rabbit hole. So this is the book I showed earlier on. Really recommend everyone goes out and gets a copy. It's not expensive. It's a thin book. In Love with Venus, Touch of Astronomy Can Change Your Life Forever. And this is just a little glimpse inside the beginning of chapter 3, The Dance of Venus. Now, what I'm going to introduce you to, some of you probably are aware of this, but the planet Venus does the most amazing geometric orbit between the planet Earth and the Sun. And it takes her, planet Venus, takes her 8 years to create a 5-petaled flower or pentagram around the Earth. She does that over an 8-year period. Fascinating geometry, and this book explains it to you. So this is a kind of diagram of the orbit that planet Venus makes every 8 years. So there's 2 numbers to be aware of in this kind of organic, natural, sacred geometry of the planet Venus is 5 petals, or 5 arms of a pentagram, 5 petals of a dog rose, and an 8-year period. So every 8 years she makes a 5-petaled flower, then she carries on to repeat the sequence. It's a long drawing, it takes 8 years to draw this, and planet Earth would be in the center. It's very important. Okay, so numerically then, that sacred geometry is a harmonic expression of what's now known as the Fibonacci sequence, which was realized by a chap called Fibonacci. He was a medieval Italian mathematician, and his observation was very simple, but quite wonderful and quite brilliant, of course. You know, the best magic is always simple magic. Things that get complicated are usually just in the head and not of much real meaning to the world. You know, keep it simple, stupid, you know, KISS, K-I-S-S. The real magic is always simple. So here's his observation. It's just simple numbers. So 1 and 1 is 2. And then you add those together. So 1 and 2 becomes 3. Then add 2 and 3 becomes 5. 3 and 5 become 8, and 8 and 5 become 13, and it continues. You know, 8 and 13 would become 21. But this kind of growth, this numerical growth, is largely what nature does in many, many ways. And the orbit of Venus is part of this harmony, part of this mathematical sequence, because it's 5 and 8. Every 8 years, Venus makes a 5-petaled rose. You know, fascinating. So it's attuned with and harmonic with the Fibonacci sequence. And if you plot it out like this, you can see it goes 5, 8, 13, 21, and the smaller squares above the 5 are the 3, 2, 1, you know, and that numerical code is how nature works often, you know, from shells spiraling outwards to ferns unfurling, even to galaxies spinning around. You know, this spiral of time is very much an expression of the Fibonacci sequence. It's like a mathematical formula of growth. It's really interesting. The French artist Rodin said that everything spirals outwards from within. And that's kind of what's happening with the Fibonacci. Every expression is spiraling outwards of one's intent or receiving of external influences. Getting carried away with myself. So Venus is also more than that, and that's mind-blowing already. So on the left, this is a diagram, not true to scale, but it's a diagram of the sun and planet Earth. So the sun is in the top left-hand corner, planet Earth is towards the bottom right-hand corner, with the moon shown going around. So the moon orbits around planet Earth as Earth orbits around the sun. But between Earth and the sun are the planets Mercury and Venus. Okay, so Venus, or what we're paying our attention to now, is in the light, if you like. Mercury and Venus are in the sunlight between Earth and the sun. All the other planets are behind planet Earth, you know, so Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, they're in deeper space, they're in darker space, if you like. But Mercury and Venus are in the realm of sunlight, symbolically. And the Greeks actually called Mercury and Venus paradromi. Paradromi means runs with the sun. That is, they travel with the sun. Now, something very magical about that, because more often than not, the planet Venus, as illustrated on the right-hand side here with these paintings, can be the morning star or the evening star. So can Mercury. Mercury and Venus can both take it in turns, being the morning star and the evening star, but more often than not, it's Venus is a bit more easier to see with the naked eye at dawn and dusk and so on. And that's the clue to her importance here, is that she is a shining star at dawn and dusk, at different times of her big orbit, making the big 5-petaled flower over an 8-year period. As she does each of the petals, sometimes she's evening star, sometimes she's morning star. So really complicated weaving that she does. The two paintings on the right-hand side are in the Museum of Avalon in Burgundy. They're painted by, they were painted by a French artist called Georges Rano, and they're both paintings of Venus. The one on the left is called Stella Matutina, which means star of the morning star. And the one on the right is Stella Vespertina, which means star of the evening star. So here's the thing then, this is to do with something called crepuscular magic. Crepuscular magic is dawn and dusk magic, twilight magic, or what you could call the fairy realm, twilight realm, you know, the land of the setting sun. In the bottom corner of the diagram on the left, where you can see Earth with the moon going around it, on the left it says dusk and it says dawn. So as Earth is spinning, wherever you are, say you're in England, England turns towards the dawn, and then it's daytime, and it carries on turning towards the dusk, and then it's nighttime, you know. So it's Earth spinning that makes day and night. You know, the sun is always shining on one side of the planet, and that's daytime wherever it is, and it's to do with Earth spinning. But Earth is orbiting around the sun. So there is this permanent dawn and dusk is always there. It's like a liminal space between the sunlight area, daytime, and the deep space area, nighttime. You know, day and night is caused by Earth spinning. Day and night are realms. Day is towards the sun, night is away from planet Earth. So in a way, there's this perpetual liminal space of twilight, and planet Earth rotates into the dusk, into the dawn, and then into the dusk. And like I said, sometimes Venus is the morning star, sometimes she's the evening star, sometimes Mercury is. But this makes two symbolic talking heavenly luminaries, heavenly shining ones that relate to dawn and dusk, to twilight. It's the Lord and Lady of the twilight realm is what Mercury and Venus are at different times of their orbits and stuff, you know. And symbolically, you could call that the Lord and Lady of Fairy, the fairy realm. You know, it's the other world in some ways, in that way. So with the things I'm going to show you, when I talk about the fairy queen or queen, you know, Titania and Oberon in Shakespeare and all that kind of stuff, it's that these, those heavenly luminaries that run with the sun and shine in the sky at dawn and dusk, the fairy time, the liminal space between one world and the other, is what we're looking at with a lot of this lore. And it was used in the Elizabethan era and later periods of time, and it was heavily, I would say, I can't, you know, I'm not going to prove it right now, but I would say it was heavily suppressed in the 1600s with the persecution of people accused of witchcraft and so on. As much as the witches apparently worshipped a horned god, the symbol of Mercury has horns, they also worshipped the Queen of Elfheim, the fairy queen, you know. So the law between witches and fairy is there in the witch trial evidence of the 1600s. And, you know, it's a case, I would argue, of Puritanism crashing down on anything that's esoteric or magical or otherworldly. Anyway, another way of depicting a pentagram, and maybe a more beautiful way than the 5 spikes, you know, and closer to the petals that the planet Venus makes, is the 5-petaled rose, which was made famous in England by the Tudor rose, which is the coming together of the red rose and the white rose of York and Lancaster, and it's to do the War of the Roses and all of that stuff. But with the Tudors, it became one thing. But it also had a massive Welsh influence, because the Tudor line is a Welsh culture that was brought very much to England. You know, like these days, people think of the royal coat of arms as a lion and a unicorn. Well, the unicorn came with James I from Scotland, and prior to that, the coat of arms of Elizabeth I was a lion and a dragon because of Wales. It was the red dragon of Wales was balanced against the lion. And then when the Tudor line finished, the Stuart line took over. They replaced the Red Dragon of Wales with the unicorn. That was a Scottish thing. Yeah, so fascinating. So all those things are there, and the Welsh elements of Welsh mysticism, Welsh folklore, Welsh paganism, whispering that quietly, finds its way into Elizabethan Renaissance. So symbols that are equal to the pentagram then is the 5-petaled rose, which was triumphant in the era of Elizabeth I. And then for alchemists and astrologers, the symbol for the planet Venus is this. It's a big circle and a cross, and that's a symbol for the planet Venus. And that gets used in esoteric, occult ways from now on, as I'll demonstrate. Simplistically, a rose is the circle and a cross. Isn't the Christian crucifix, but later on it becomes that. It's actually an equal-armed cross, which is more to do with what's called the Royal Star Cross, which arguably is Imbolc, Beltane, Lunacy, and Samhain, so overcomplicating things. But here's the thing then. I was playing around with sacred geometry used by the Rosicrucians, and it was doing that actually led to looking at the Ogham as 20 trees in a circle. So it's quite interesting that, it wasn't a contrived thing, it was an accidental thing that I've explained elsewhere. But simplistically, sacred geometry, a circle is 360 degrees. If you divide it into 20, each piece is 18 degrees wide. That's just the mathematics of it. And so dividing a circle into 20 equal divisions gives you this, a rose and a cross. Big circle and a cross, rose and a cross. These are going to be the recurring things. And further on, I'll explain this in a bit more detail, how it's used. I can't think of a better word, how it's used magically and so on. This is from the 1600s, around about 1630. It's an illustration from a work by an alchemist called Robert Flood. But look at it carefully. Big rose in the middle, of course. But the stem of the rose, if you follow it down, has a crossbar. So it's almost hidden, it's almost occulted. But quite clearly it's the symbol for Venus. It's the circle and a cross. It's that symbol turned into a rose and a cross, same as that. They've just dropped the cross down to make it the symbol of Venus. The inscription above relates to alchemy, and that many layers to that, of course, but it translates into modern English as the rose gives honey to the bees. You can see there's a bee flying towards the rose, and there's a bee sitting on the rose. So the bees attracted to the honey, or the heart of the rose, the nectar at the center of the rose, can have many meanings, as alchemy always does have many layers of meaning. But of course, the alchemists or the Rosicrucians or those in the court of Elizabeth I, because she was the rose, are being drawn to the nectar, to the gold at the center, and there's many layers of meaning to that. But I was just going to show you how the rose and cross are a continuation of Venus and how that is used. So the Rosicrucians then, a mysterious group of people that I can't think of the right words, created a movement against Catholicism, against religious persecution, and they wanted to be free to explore the mysteries of the world, whether it's psychic, occult, magical mysteries, or whether it's mathematics and chemistry and geometry, the beginnings of science, all of those things. They just wanted to be free thinking, and to just explore the world, you know. And anyway, their imagery and their artwork is full of so many layers of complication. Now, this picture is meant to represent the college or the university of the Rosicrucians. And yeah, you could talk about it for hours. But in the middle, there's a funny little building on wheels, you know, and there's a front door to it with some writing above. And if this is a close-up, you can see above the two windows, on the left, there's a rose, and on the right, there's an equal-armed cross. I'm emphasizing that it's not a crucifix, it's not Christianity, it's an equal-armed cross, and it's a rose, you know. So the rose and cross are there in this ludicrously complicated picture, which is to do with stars appearing in the constellation of Cygnus and Draco, and much other complicated esoteric ideas. But their symbols of the rose and cross are there, symbols of Venus and the science or awareness of the energies and magic spirit of nature. In the 1970s, a lady called Frances Yates wrote this really brilliant book now called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And she talks about the mysticism of the Rosicrucians and their ideas that they wanted to explore, and how their movement was incorporated into Freemasonry, which came later. You know, the early decades of Freemasonry incorporated a lot of Rosicrucian mysticism and combined it with other things like Hermeticism and so on, and Christian mysticism. There's so many, gets more and more complicated with each century. But Frances Yates put forward the idea that maybe one of the big influences behind the Rosicrucian movement was the Elizabethan alchemist, Dr. John Dee. Now, John Dee was the kind of Gandalf or Merlin of Elizabeth I, a fascinating man, an alchemist, an astronomer, and so on. An all-round Leonardo da Vinci type, you know, thinking way ahead into the future and thinking of the other world. You know, he did psychic experiments to communicate with angels, but that's not so much a Christian thing as the angelos, messengers from the spirit world, although he was a Protestant Church of England Christian. As was Elizabeth, you know, she was the head of the Church of England and stuff. But what was quite unique with Elizabeth's court was that it was, in its own way, Rosicrucian before there was Rosicrucianism. It was free thinking, or, you know, it was free to think of classical gods and goddesses, maybe Celtic, Bardic mysteries. It was just into exploring any insights that were possible, you know, from all over the known world at that time. So Elizabeth herself then famously never married, although there's conspiracy theories, and she managed just to look after England for a long time, and she almost deliberately stepped into this role of being what we could now call the fairy queen. And we're not talking tiny little Tinkerbell fairies, you know, we're talking about personifications of Venus and Mercury, and personifications of the spirits of the twilight realm, just like Dee communicating with angels and stuff. Elizabeth willingly played the role symbolically of being the Rose Queen. You know, she was Queen of England. Her main symbol was the Tudor rose, the 5-petaled flower. And the astronomers like John Dee understood what it represented. You know, in the bottom right-hand corner in her cloak, you can just about make out a brownish Tudor rose amongst all of the foliage. Now, the rose symbol, and of course it means Venus, was massive to Elizabeth. I'm going to show some examples about how she used it repeatedly, very much with all the pomp and regalia of court. She set herself up as the Rose Queen, or the Queen of Fairy, and the mysticism that it held. You know, I want to draw your attention to the two men in red in the right-hand corner, because upon their chests are the rose. You know, her men-at-arms in the courts, they actually had the rose on their chests. They were, what could you call it, no rose knights or knights of the rose, or whatever. And it's really important because this gets carried on. You know, that thing about the rose gives honey to the bees. You know, these are the bees around the Rose Queen. In her own lifetime, later in her years, Sir Edmund Spenser wrote the famous poem, The Fairy Queen. And The Fairy Queen is an allegorical poem about Elizabeth I and the Order of the Garter, which were all of her knights, all of her drones, all of her bees, you know, and that's the bedrock of the Fairy Queen poetry written by Edmund Spenser. And the picture on the right-hand side is a recurring main character in the Fairy Queen. He's called the Red Crossed Knight. You know, it's the knight with the red cross. But really it's St. George and the dragon, and Elizabeth I's knights, or drones, bumblebees, her knights were the Order of the Garter. And the Order of the Garter, the main symbol is St. George and the dragon. You know, they all have that on their crest and everything. So the red crossed knight is St. George, and he's the main hero in the story of the Fairy Queen, working for Queen of Fairy and so on. So in different paintings of Elizabeth, she plays this out. So in this painting on the right, I would call it the Red Queen or the Rose Queen. And on the left-hand side, you can see the Tudor rose, which is under the table on the left hand of her main painting there. It's really worth analysing all the details of these Elizabethan paintings. You know, around the Tudor rose here is the garter of the Order of the Garter. So that's like the knights or the bumblebees or drones of the Order of the Garter protecting the rose. That's kind of there as a basic symbol. And then a close-up on this painting, you can see she's wearing a rose on her left shoulder. It's separate to all of her costume. There just is a rose attached to her shoulder there. And more interesting than that, her right hand is holding a rose. You know, they're fascinating, very deliberate details in this painting of the Red Queen or the Rose Queen. You know, and equally, sometimes she's the White Queen. There's a kind of yin and yang of this red and white roses idea. This is a famous painting of her as more of a fairy queen. Again, she's getting on in years, but she's still this kind of perpetual virgin fairy queen. And the interesting thing with this painting is she's standing on a map of England, and I'll come to that. But the picture on the right, the close-up, if you look carefully at her left shoulder, there's a pink rose attached to her collar. You know, recurringly, she is the Rose Queen. Whatever costume she's wearing, the rose is usually attached or in the costume design itself. And the very flamboyant collar that she's wearing almost looks like fairy wings, you know, that kind of playing with the fairy queen idea. But the map she's standing on, then this is a map of England, and it's later in the years. It's about her successfully protecting England against the Spanish Armada and so on. But it's a very precise map, and between her feet, it's hard to read, it's the city of Oxford. Now, if you know your Welsh stories, like Dr. John Dee did, he was Welsh. There is a story incorporated in the Mabinogion called Llys and Llefelys, and it tells of these monstrous dragons that scream every Beltane, and the demigod Leith has to bring them down and bury them, but before he can bury them, he has to capture them in the center of his kingdom. And he works out the center of his kingdom, and it's Oxford, you know. So she's actually standing at the very center of Britain, as understood by the Welsh Bardic law of the late medieval times, you know, that Oxford was the center of the kingdom of Leith. And then when he caught the two dragons, the red and white dragons, he buried them at Dinas Emrys, you know. But that's just to point out the, you know, a glimpse of Welsh law finding its way to be expressed in Tudor artwork. You know, interesting, because Tudor is a big Welsh influence, like John Dee had Welsh origins and so on. So jumping ahead a little bit, Rosicrucian mysticism was incorporated into Freemasonry, and the higher ranks of Freemasonry, not your normal standard Freemasonry, there's what would you call it? A kind of, I can't think of the right word. There's a type of Freemasonry that's now known as ancient and accepted Scottish Rite Freemasonry. We can just say Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And what's interesting about that is it has 33 degrees. This is 33 positions to attain for people that do it. They work their way up from the first degree to the second to the third, and eventually they work their way to the top. They become a 33rd degree member of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Anyway, by the by with all of that, what's interesting is there's at the position of the 18th degree, each degree has a title, and the title of the 18th degree of Scottish Rite Freemasonry is the Knight of the Rose Cross. That is knight in shining armor, not nighttime. So it's the Knight of the Rose Cross. So that's Rosicrucian things being absorbed into Freemasonry. Now this symbol, this is called a jewel. It's like a badge or a medallion that a Freemason would wear if they had achieved the position of the 18th degree of Scottish Rite. This is your trophy, this is your medallion to say you've achieved that rank. So it's called the 18th degree Rose Cross jewel. On one side, it depicts the pelican pecking its breast to feed its young. It's a symbol of self-sacrifice. And you can see a cross, which has become a crucifix, Christianized, and above it, the red rose. So you've got the rose and the cross. Again, that's Venus, really, because the rose and the cross make the symbol of Venus. And on the other side, there's an eagle, you know. So there's two birds. There's a pelican and an eagle, both on either side of this jewel. Now, going back in time to Elizabeth again, she is depicted in artwork of her era with a pelican and an eagle, you know. So this kind of iconography is existed before Freemasonry. Freemasonry absorbed ideas from lots of different places, you know, and whatever the pelican and eagle mean in modern Freemasonry, the origin is the court of Elizabeth I, or the court of Elizabeth I had a massive influence upon Rosicrucian occultism. As complicated as all that is, it's just a celebration of Venus. But Venus not just as a planet, but Venus as a goddess of nature, you know. And yeah, Mother Nature, or you could even call her Nemetona if you wanted to be Celtic about it, you know, goddess of the grove, goddess of the trees, goddess of all of the flowers, the goddess Flora to the Romans. They're all aspects of Venus, goddess of love and goddess of flowers, you know. So that position that we just talked about, the 18th degree of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, it suddenly dawned on me many years ago. I was pondering it. I'm not a Freemason, I've never been involved, but I was researching a lady called Catherine Maltwood, and she was talking about Scottish Rite Freemasonry in the 18th degree. So I was thinking about it and trying to make sense of it. And a very simple thing then, the 18th degree is not just the 18th position in this Masonic progress system. It is actually 18 degrees. You know, the main symbols of Freemasonry are a compass and a set square, and the compass is meant to be used for whatever you use a compass for, which is clearly geometry, you know. So cutting a long story short, as I mentioned earlier, a circle divided by 18 degrees creates 20 equal spaces, which then, of course, gives you 20 trees of the Ogham, or that they can be interplayed with that way. But looking at the diagram on the left, then this is complicated, but try and keep it simple. The circle at the bottom, you use the radius. That's the space from the center of the circle to the edge of the circle. That distance with the compass then creates what you can see as the first veil, the second veil, and the third veil. Those three veils, the distance between them is the radius of the circle at the bottom. So this is pure geometry, okay? You use the radius to create the first veil, the second veil, and the third veil for this geometry. And this sacred geometry goes way back to the builders of medieval cathedrals. You know, it's not Freemasonry. Freemasonry just absorbed it from older traditions. So, but the three veils are used in Freemasonry in various ceremonies, but equally they're from the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition. The Kabbalistic tree of life has three veils. You know, this is a geometric way of expressing those veils. And the Kabbalistic tree of life is about drawing down energy into the material realm, which is done by magical people with their intent, with their minds. They have to visualize and imagine. And that's how intention works, and magic follows people's intention and stuff. So here's the thing then. If you have your three veils and you imagine light, the divine light, or however you want to imagine it, you could think of the R one actually, I'll come back to that. Light penetrating the third veil at the top at 18 degrees will go through the second veil, the third veil, into the physical realm and express itself as 72 degrees, which is 1/5 of a pentagram. So if you were a magical person wanting to draw down the energies of Venus the five-pointed star or the five-petaled rose, it would enter at 18 degrees. Hitting the second veil, it would become 24 degrees wide. Hitting the first veil, it would become 36 degrees wide, and then it would manifest on the ground as 72 degrees wide. You know, so it's a way of visualizing light penetrating from the spirit world into the material world, or radiating down on the magic person, visualizing the light that corresponds with the planet or goddess Venus. All Knights of the Rose Cross would do this to align themselves with the energies of the goddess Venus. Big stuff, really. 18 degrees again. So that first penetration of light in modern Druidism, the Druidic revivalism of the 1800s, the most popular symbol that was created by a guy called Iolo Morganwg is what we call the Arwen, which is like three pillars of light shining down. And his very first publication, in which he showed this symbol of three bars shining down, they're 18 degrees wide. The light of the Arwen, according to Iolo Morganwg, was 18 degrees wide. Whether that's a Masonic influence or whether he understood 18 degrees and Rosicrucianism, who knows? But the three pillars or three rays of light of modern Druidism is an acknowledgement of Venus, really. It's fascinating because the Ogham Grove is almost the energy, well, it's the energies of Venus laid out on the surface of the ground in a sacred circle, a grove of 20 trees. It is that Rose Queen, you know, and a more kind of modern day understanding of that now is the, you know, the goddess of the grove we would call Nemetona, just means she of the sacred grove. But it suggests an influence of Venus more than the sun or the moon, you know, that Venus is defining the grove and shining down into its center. Very interesting ideas. So after Freemasonry at the end of the 1800s, there was a famous occult group order called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And their mysticism primarily was Rosicrucian. This is their famous Rosy Cross. You know, it's one of the main symbols, if you like, you know, and you'll see pentagrams on each side of the arms. And the circular thing is a rose. It corresponds with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the 22 major arcana of the tarot. But if you zoom in on the Golden Dawn Rosy Cross, there in the center is the rose on the cross. The crucifix, again, not the equal armed cross, because by now it's Christian mysticism. It's changed from its Elizabethan and Rosicrucian origins. It's been drawn back into Christian mysticism rather than free thinking again. But that idea of the heart of the rose was a big thing in the Victorian mind. You know, this is a painting by the pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones, shows the heart of the rose. You know, the rose is Venus, and he is what, a pilgrim or an initiate reaching out, or he's a Rosicrucian reaching to the heart of the rose, or he's the bee trying to get to the honey at the center of the rose, you know. So what is the heart of the rose? What is the center of the rose? Well, it's planet Earth, of course. You know, Venus makes the 5 petals around planet Earth. So it's almost like the pentagram of Venus is protecting life on Earth, you know. Fascinating stuff, and protecting life on Earth, and also having an influence upon the flora and fauna and flowers and fruits of Earth, so on. So it's too much to go into. I'm actually studying nowadays traditional history of the witchcraft trials, and you know, there's so many ideas about it. Some of them are simple, some are conspiracy theories, but you know, the bottom line is people were killed, people were burnt and hung for not being Christian. It's the bottom line. Primarily, it was Puritans being fanatical, really, and stamping down on people that knew stuff, primarily women, which was acceptable in Elizabethan England. You know, the plays and the theatre and the dances, the costumes they designed and wore were all based on classical mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, and obscure bits of Celtic fairy lore and stuff. You know, that was there, celebrated in Elizabethan and Rosicrucianism. As soon as James I became King of England, all changes. You know, the King James Bible declared, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." You know, and within 40 years, witchcraft hysteria, big killings going on. You know, a witch could mean many things. It could be a midwife, it could be a herbalist healer, it could be someone who was quite psychic and could communicate with the other world, you know, the spirit world or whatever, and that was heavily frowned upon, you know, and attempted to be stamped out. In the records of the witchcraft trials, more often than not, the so-called witches are accused of having a horned god, and a recurring name for the horned god, which really would be Canunus or something. The Mercury symbol for Mercury has horns. It's quite interesting. Is Robin or Robin Goodfellow, like they're recurring names. And interestingly, recurring name for the goddess of the witches is the Queen of Elfheim, or Dame Venus, or just the fairy queen, you know. Fascinating. So it's almost like one way or another that Venus celebration, that understanding or worship of the goddess of twilight, sunrise and sunset, carried on until it was almost suppressed by the witchcraft hysteria. You know, it survived in Rosicrucianism, and it found its way into modern paganism, although shape-shifting all the time. The fascinating phrase is just the Rose Queen, you know, and I go with that. When I think of the Ogham and the pentagrams, primarily I just think of planet Venus making a protective pentagram around planet Earth, you know, and that the Rose Queen, or Nematona, she of the sacred grove, protects the grove. You know, she is there. And there's even a depiction on the Gundestrup cauldron of the Cassiopeia mother goddess with two big birds, one on either side of her, just like Elizabeth I with the pelican and the eagle. You know, it's kind of like a recurring thing, that there is just this great goddess of nature overseeing everything, really, all of the herbalism, all life on earth, and so on. And the best phrase to finish with that I ever heard about the Rose Queen, or Venus, is that she is the queen of every hive. It's really worth thinking about that. She's the queen of every hive, every group of people, every country, you know, the queen of every hive. Elizabeth I was just the queen of her kingdom. You know, she was the queen of her hive, but the Rose Queen Venus herself, that Elizabeth represented for a while, Venus herself is the Queen of Every Hive, a bit like Isis being all goddesses, or all goddesses are Isis, or yeah. Anyway, that's that. Hope that explains, well, it kind of explains my ideas about the pentagram, and maybe it gives some food for thought. As for the 4 pentagrams that are there in the Ogham Grove, anchored on winter solstice, spring equinox, summer solstice, and autumn equinox, it's just a fascinating awareness. I don't know how to make more sense of it than that. And sacred geometry, then, if you were working in the center of your grove and you wanted to draw down Venus energy through the 3 veils, you know, it's a Kabbalistic way of thinking, so you don't have to do it that way. It's just a Hermetic way of thinking. It would penetrate the top veil at 18 degrees. And you could take that idea to then experiment with other ideas in the center of your grove. You know, what angle of degree would the light of the sun enter the center of the grove, or the light of the moon? You know, what angle of degree would you visualize that from a geometric perspective? Or maybe you don't need to at all. Maybe it's much more organic and you can just think of moonlight coming down, or the morning star or evening star of Venus shining on your grove, you know. So these are just ideas. It gets more brainy and intellectual when you get to Rosicrucians and Freemasons and mathematicians and astronomers. And I suspect that earlier times, magic was much more simple. Keep it simple, stupid. KISS, KISS, you know. You don't need to be complicated about drawing down the moon or the sun or Venus, but maybe it's just about being aware and an intent to connect with the planet that protects Earth. Anyway, enough of that. Thank you. See you next time.